Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Atif Mia. I'm the director of the Julius Rabinovich Center for Public Policy and Finance, and we host these talks, public events for people with an interest in finance and public policy. And today we are extremely pleased to have two co-authors with us, Michael Pettis and Michael Klein, who will be talking about Trade Wars and Class Wars. That's the title of their excellent new book. I'll briefly introduce both of them. I have known both of them through their work for a long time now, and I've been a big fan of both of their work. So it's a great privilege that we can sort of meet in person, even though virtually. Um, Michael Pettis is based in China, and he has written multiple books earlier as well, which I've had the pleasure to read. And one common theme in his work has been that distribution really matters in terms of understanding the macroeconomy. And a lot of his work has focused on the distribution of income or disposable income rather between the middle class, the working class, and the owners of capital, if you will. And what he has argued very convincingly, in my opinion, is that that division really matters for driving macro variables that we care about. In particular, think of trade deficits and so on, and a lot of that work him and Michael will talk about. And Michael, coming more from the journalism direction, has been writing on these issues very cogently, based on data, based on facts for a while now. And so it's great to see the two of them join in this partnership. And as I said, we are extremely pleased to have them. It's really a terrific book. I would urge all of you to read it and to share it with your friends and family. When people ask me, what are sort of quote unquote easy to read books, in the sense that the book communicates very well with the public and has a very deep insight to help us understand the economy around us, this is one of the first books that I mentioned to them. So it's really a terrific book, and I do encourage all of you to go read it. Here's a quick formal introduction. Michael Klein, he is the economics commentator at Barron's. And of course, as I said, he's the co-author of Trade Wars or Class Wars. Michael Pettis, he is a finance professor at the, I hope I pronounced it correctly, Zhonghua School of Peking University, and senior fellow at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center. And he has been in China for the past 18 years. So officially a China expert, Michael. Very pleased to have you both. The format is the authors will introduce their work for a few minutes, and then we'll open up for question and answers, and I'll be moderating that. So please punch in your questions as you have them in the Q&A window, and I'll be happy to relay those to the authors. So over to you, Michael and Matt, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Atif. I'm really honored to participate in something that you're hosting, because I've stolen quite a few of your ideas and then passed on your papers to quite a lot of people. So this is a real pleasure. What Matt and I thought we would do is I would sort of lay out the basic framework of our book, what it is that we're arguing. I'll try to do it in 10 minutes or so. And then Matt will pick up from that and focus on some of the specific cases. The basic argument of our book is that there's a great deal of misconception about what causes trade and capital imbalances in the world. What we argue is that trade imbalances are largely the consequence of distortions in the way income is distributed in various countries. So very specifically, there's a common perception that countries that run large trade surpluses like Germany, Japan, China, etc., do so because they are especially efficient at exports, particularly hardworking, very thrifty, and we argue that that's not the case at all. Um, the reason countries run trade surpluses has to do with the way income is distributed domestically. Basically, as you know, the trade account, the trade surplus, really the current account, but this doesn't change the argument, is a function of the excess of domestic savings over domestic investment. And what we argue is that countries that run surpluses, by definition, they have excess savings relative to their domestic investment. And the reason they have such high savings is because of the way income is shared between various sectors within the economy. So you can, for example, divide an economy into a number of sectors, and for the purpose of this argument, the entire economy consists of ordinary households, rich households, businesses, and governments. Everybody, every entity is within that group. And what happens is that most consumption takes place among ordinary households. Ordinary households consume most of their income. Um, Businesses consume none of their income. Governments consume very little of their income. And the rich, of course, also consume very little of their income. And by definition, everything that's not consumed is saved. Saving just means not consuming. And in countries like Germany or China or Japan, where you have extremely high savings rates, the reason you have such high savings rates is because of policies that either directly or indirectly shifted income away from ordinary households and towards one of those other three groups, the very rich, businesses, or particularly in the case of China, governments, local governments. And so when that happens, when you shift $100 of income from an ordinary household that might consume $80 of it, and you shift it over, say, to the wealthy who might consume $10 or $20 of it, just the very act of shifting income will automatically reduce domestic consumption and increase domestic savings. So what we argue is that surplus countries, countries that are running these large and persistent trade surpluses, are doing so for structural reasons. And the reasons have to do with the way domestic income is distributed. We further argue that in a highly globalized world, this creates sort of a self-reinforcing process in which countries become competitive in terms of international business. They gain export competitiveness by basically implementing policies that directly or indirectly reduce the wage share or the household income share of GDP. They can do it directly by reducing wages, which is more or less what Germany did after the Hartz reforms in 2003. They can do it indirectly by undermining the social safety net, environmental degradation, depreciating the currency. There are a number of ways you can do this, but basically what happens is that it transfers income from ordinary households to some other groups within the economy. This allows them to gain export competitiveness. Now, if they were closed economies, this would create a big problem, because if you consume and invest less than you produce, or to put it another way, if you save more than you invest, then somehow you have to resolve those excess savings and that excess production. And the way you resolve it domestically, assuming you're a closed economy, is you can allow unemployment to rise, because basically you're not consuming everything that you're producing. So manufacturers have to close down production facilities and fire workers. Or you can take a number of other steps. You can boost the fiscal investment, fiscal spending, or you can somehow organize the financial system to increase household debt. Now, none of those are really, really good things. But what ends up happening is that if you have an open economy, and most economies are open economies, you have a fourth possibility, and that is to export the excess savings and simultaneously export the excess production. So what ends up happening, we argue, is that countries that want to gain international competitiveness in order to boost domestic employment do so effectively by directly or indirectly lowering wages. And in doing so, they end up running large trade surpluses that must be absorbed by other countries. And it's this absorption by other countries that creates a real problem. Most of the excess savings in the world ends up being absorbed by the US, not because the US needs to borrow this money, uh, but rather because the US has completely open capital markets. It's got very good governance, very flexible financial system. And so excess savings, roughly 40 to 50% of the excess savings in the world, end up flowing into the United States. Now, it's a rule of the balance of payments that if the US is a net absorber of international capital, in other words, if it runs a surplus on the capital account, it must automatically run a deficit on the current account, and that deficit must be represented by an excess of investment over savings. And here's the problem. I think for a lot of economists, it's sort of a matter of faith that that means investment is higher in a country like the US than it would normally be without these inflows. And we argue, no, that's not the case. That was the case perhaps in the 19th century when the US was a developing country whose investment was constrained by the lack of domestic savings. But today we argue in most advanced economies, there is no savings constraint. There's tons of savings. Capital is widely available at the lowest interest rates in history. Before COVID-19, American companies were sitting on huge hoards of cash, for which they had no productive use. So exporting savings into the US doesn't cause investment to go up. But by definition, in that case, it must cause savings to go down. There must be that gap between investment and savings. And I think one of the things that we try to do in this book, which you've also done, Atif, in one of your I think one of your very important papers, is to argue that there is a relationship between the between debt in the host country and the increase in savings, whether it's created through through an increase in income inequality or through an importation of savings from abroad. And basically, I don't want to get too technical here, but if an inflow of capital does not cause investment to rise, it must cause savings to decline. And the ways in which it causes savings to decline, there are many ways this can happen. But basically, they boil down to three ways. One way is for unemployment to go up. And of course, that's something that the government does what it can to prevent. So the alternatives are either for the fiscal deficit to go up or to organize the financial system in such a way that household debt rises. So what we argue is that the very low consumption rate in the US is not the driver. The very high consumption rate and the very low savings rate is not the driver of the US current account deficit. It's actually the other way around. The fact that the US runs a current account deficit is because other countries have excess savings, which they automatically export to the US. And because the US must import those excess savings, whether it wants to or not, that automatically lowers the American savings rate. And the ways in which it can lower the American savings rate is either through higher unemployment, a higher household debt, or higher fiscal deficit. Now, I'll pass this on to Matt at this point, but I think this is the basic framework. We're locked in a system in which inequality breeds imbalances, and imbalances worsen the inequality among the trading partners. So, Matt, why don't you pick it up from there?
Thank you, Michael, and also, thank you again, Atif, for hosting this and putting this together. As Michael said, a lot of your work is very much, deeply informs what we wrote. In particular, one point I just want to highlight is that when we talk about increase in inequality and transfers of income, those things necessarily have to go in line with changes in the savings rate of other entities. So if you, it's not, if you are an owner of a business and your business is generating either constant or higher sales, while the consumers, that would presumably be buying from your business are having stagnant incomes, then the only way they can reconcile that through somehow is through some higher level of borrowing, and either by dissaving or actually taking on debt. And globally, that's essentially what we've been seeing over the past several decades, as we've been seeing globally change in the distribution of income and a global increase in debt. And then the angle that we bring to this is that where we're seeing the increases in the profits and the increases in debt aren't all in the same place, and that's what we're showing as these trade imbalances and financial imbalances. So looking at a lot of what we spend time in the book doing is actually providing sort of a detailed historical account of the major economies to show exactly how this happened. Because it's one thing, it's this is very important to sort of explain this, and then people say, oh, well, it could have been something else. How do you know it was one and not the other? And so it's very useful to actually go through and look at it. And I think just going through sort of the way we describe it in the book, we're starting with we focus on China, Germany, and the United States, the three biggest economies. Germany, of course, also affecting Europe as a whole, and that's again, those are the three biggest economies by far. We also talk a bit about Japan and Korea and elsewhere, but those are other surplus economies generally are somehow contain elements of either the China or the Germany story. Just as other of the major deficit economies such as the UK or Australia have a lot of similarities with the US. So we tried to be representative. What we've seen in China that's really interesting, and a lot of this comes from looking at the research that Michael's done over the past many years of living there, is that the government there really pursued a strategy over the past 30 years of the question of how do you attain rapid sustained growth, while at the same time maintaining a degree of sort of concentration of ownership of real resources and political control. And essentially, you can think of it as a transition from the period in the 1980s where growth was driven by productivity improvements from essentially the end of Maoism, and letting people in the countryside, create small businesses and develop an agricultural surplus, to okay, we're going to try to just generate as much rapid growth as quickly as possible while maintaining a degree of control after the instability of the late 1980s. And that ended up leading to a very, very sharp decline in household income as a share of total Chinese production. So the Chinese economy grew a lot, household income grew a lot, but the share of income in China went from something on the order of like 55% to some at the bottom is about 35%, which is extraordinarily low. That's comparable to basically what you saw in the Soviet Union under Stalin. And it's gone up a little bit since then, but we're still talking below 40%, which is an extremely low share of income earned by households. And so, where does the rest of it gone? It's mostly gone to companies in China, whether it's private businesses or state-owned enterprises, or the joint ventures, or local governments themselves. The distinction between these elements is somewhat fuzzy if you sort of look at think about governance or whatever their economic role, but that's essentially where it has gone, and it's shown up in the form of essentially operating profits and much higher inequality within China among households. And how has this happened? There's a few points. One of the biggest ones is that a lot of workers in China, hundreds of millions of workers in China who came from the countryside to the cities, they aren't eligible for a lot of the standard government benefits that are awarded to people who are from the cities originally. And that includes things like healthcare, education, housing rights. And they also, in theory, could be deported for a variety of reasons from wherever they're living in the major cities back to their village where they came from. And that obviously reduces their bargaining power as well. And so one of the major reasons why Chinese workers have earned such a low share of income, relative to workers in the rest of the world, is because of this kind of repression. It's not the only thing. There's also, of course, the long history of land expropriation, where local governments would essentially take land from, the peasants or whatever to give the developers, and essentially eminent domain without fair compensation at a very massive scale. And that's obviously a subsidy to business. Michael also mentioned environmental policy. You can think of if you can think of pollution essentially as a tax imposed by a business on everyone who's around them and has to breathe the air, drink the water, and you try to have environmental regulation to sort of offset that impact, but if you don't, then essentially what happens is households are paying for it out of their own well-being for the profitability of those businesses there. In many cases, those businesses, by the way, are not even necessarily owned by Chinese, so that it's not as if it's a question of the Chinese government working to harm one group of Chinese for the benefit of others. That's certainly sometimes the case, but sometimes it's also the case where elites in China are working with effectively elites in the West against their own workers. And there are a lot of other mechanisms as well. One last one just before we move on to other economies that Michael's mentioned a lot is interest rate policy, where for a very long time, um, the only option you had if you were a household in China to save money was to put it in one of the big local banks. And the interest rate that you would get on your deposits, which is the only way you could save money, was extremely low relative to either the economic growth rate or the lending rate that would be offered by those banks to sort of politically connected companies. And so the result of this was that companies could borrow at very, very cheap rates relative to the growth economy. So essentially any borrowing would have a very positive return for them. The banks would make money because the deposit rate was even lower, so they still earn a positive spread. And then the cost of this was coming from households. They would effectively be paying it because they're essentially lending for free a lot of whatever savings they had to companies to invest in and get rich. And Michael's calculated this is worth 3 to 5%, or was worth 3 to 5% of Chinese GDP every year, which is an enormous amount of money. So that's an example, sort of a highlight of what are the things that happened in China led to this outcome. Germany is a very different story. What you saw in Germany was that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of communism in Eastern Europe, reunification, that initially the businesses in West Germany and governments and the government there were very optimistic that the absorption of East Germany would lead to an economic boom, because the feeling was, well, these are our people, they speak the same language. Surely, if we just fix their government and we can bring in our managerial expertise and our technology, they can quickly converge and everything will be great. And that didn't work out nearly as well as they thought. There were a couple of specific policy choices that were made in the early 90s that sort of made it a problem. There are other things that people have looked at subsequently in terms of, well, maybe the Germans on the East German side actually sort of self-selected, and there were actually differences in terms of their attitudes towards business and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of explanations, but it didn't work, and it ended up being very disappointing. It was actually a long growth bust throughout the 1990s, and that led a lot of German companies based in the West to conclude that they were going to be either just, not giving anyone wage increases, or they were just going to sort of offshore outsource whatever production to much cheaper places in Central and Eastern Europe, whether it was, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, places like that. And that ended up putting severe downward pressure on wages in Germany. This was compounded then by, sort of policy choices that were made in Germany in terms of sort of the macroeconomic stance in the early 2000s, that also compounded by the choices of the ECB. Germany happened to have a relatively weak economy at a time when, the economies of Spain, Ireland were booming. And so you had a situation where interest rates in Germany were relatively high, arguably way too high relative to what the domestic economy needed. And so you had this big sort of bust in corporate investment in Germany. You had a lot of people get laid off. And then the government essentially stepped in and said, well, if we want to increase employment, then clearly the best thing we can do is sort of following on actually what the US had done a few years earlier, essentially is you make welfare benefits less generous, and that will force people to find jobs. And there were a few other things they did as well, but that was sort of the big takeaway of the Hartz sphere reforms. And they did that, and it ended up working in sort of the narrow sense of there were a lot fewer people getting benefits. The employment numbers, strictly speaking, did go up, but most of the people who were working, first of all, most of the jobs added were very low paying part-time jobs. And if you look at who actually was increasing their employment rate, it was mostly people in sort of the 55 to 64 age range. People who essentially would have, they just effectively taken early retirement before getting their state pension, and was living off unemployment till the end. And they, got a job as a janitor or a sweet sweeper, something like that. And that's not, was that really an employment miracle as other people, outside Germany perceive it? I mean, I would say no. Certainly didn't lead to an increase in consumption in Germany. In fact, when you look at the German statistics of the share of German workers in poverty, it rose dramatically right in the spirit in 2005, 2006. In fact, German household income as a whole was lower by the 2010s than it was in the late 1990s, even though you had many more people working, and in theory you had, a larger economy. And so what happened was this massive transfer between the late 90s and sort of 2008 to German companies. The profitability increased by an enormous amount. And because German companies essentially could keep selling the same stuff they were selling to the rest of the world, even as their domestic costs went down, being wages. And that essentially, another way of looking at it is that because workers had less money, Germany was spending less on imports, or German businesses and households and so forth spending less on imports. Exports continued to grow and sort of in line with global GDP, and that led to a big shift in the current account balance, where in the 90s, in fact, really up until 2000, historically, German trade was relatively balanced. I mean, there were some slight surpluses in the 80s, but relatively small. And then starting in 2000s, you get this massive shift where by 2008 or what have you, almost 10% of German economic output was being sent to the rest of the world and not coming back in. It's a huge imbalance for an economy of that size. And just very briefly at the end, the United States, seems like that should be a situation as well, where the U.S. is a trade surplus. But, the U.S. is a very unequal society. In fact, more so than Germany, and it also experienced many of the same things that Germany experienced over the same periods of time, whether it was welfare reform, whether it was a corporate investment bust in the early 2000s. And yet you see the opposite dynamic. And this is where it's really important to get back to what Michael was saying at the beginning, which is that if foreigners or people outside the United States, rather, are very determined to buy U.S. assets, then that is going to end up leading to changes in the U.S. domestic financial system and economy that will end up, offsetting whatever those, natural forces would be, and lead to, essentially flip what would be a unhealthy surplus, unequal surplus economy into an even more unhealthy deficit economy. And essentially what happened was that U.S. regular households, as you have described many times in your work, particularly in the book House of Debt, essentially offset all the things that were going on at the U.S. fiscal policy, U.S. And U.S. corporate investment policy, which was that they took on an enormous amount of debt against housing to sustain consumption. It wasn't even that there was a consumption boom in any meaningful sense. If you look at sort of just the levels of how much people were spending, it basically was actually going slightly below trend during the 2000s. But production and incomes and wages and employment were worse. And so that was offset by debt. And that obviously was not a sustainable process, as you described very well. And that, there was some degree of rebalancing, if you will, after the 2008 financial crisis, but it's not enough to sort of change the general dynamics of the fact that U.S. consumption looks high because U.S. production is relatively low. And that production is low because essentially of underconsumption in the rest of the world that limits income and demand for U.S. made products, and at the same time sort of floods the U.S. market with things that are relatively lower cost than they otherwise would be because of wage suppression elsewhere.
Thanks, Michael and Matt. That was great. We'll move to some question and answers, and just a reminder to folks on the call, you can type in your questions in the Q&A window, and then I will combine them and relay them to the author. So there are a bunch of questions already. Michael, let me start with you, especially since you're based in China, and China is such an important country in this narrative of yours. As you described, the imbalance within China is doing two things. Internationally, it's leading to this trade imbalance, trade surpluses that China is running. But also internally, it's creating problems for China at the economic level, especially since 2008, it's becoming harder for China to run large imbalances because the rest of the world, US in particular, is just not able to absorb as much as it used to. So the question is more on the political side, first of all, which is and by the way, everyone seems to recognize this, including the Chinese leadership. They have said, I believe repeatedly, that there is a need to rebalance. And yet it seems to be very difficult to be able to do it. So I wonder if you can talk about why it is so difficult. What are the structural impediments within China that make the rebalance that everybody is acknowledging needs to happen, but is actually becoming very difficult to actually materialize?
Yeah, it's a very important question. Unfortunately, all debates about China tend to degenerate very quickly into whether you hate China or love China, and whether the Chinese growth model has been successful or a failure. And I think that's really the wrong way to approach it. The Chinese growth model, as Matt was discussing earlier, had sort of several different stages to it. In the first stage, which is really in the 1980s, it was mostly Deng Xiaoping removing the constraints on the Chinese economy imposed under Mao. And of course, that created a lot of growth. But the Chinese growth model per se really developed sometime in the 1990s, the early 1990s. And it's not a particular Chinese model. A lot of countries have followed this model. I call it the Gershon-Krohn model because Alexander Gershon-Krohn sort of did the best job of describing it quite early on. The problem that China faced in the late 80s and early 90s was that after 5 decades of anti-Japanese war and civil war and Maoism, it was hugely underinvested for its level of development. Institutionally, China was really a kind of middle income country in the sense that it had stable political institutions, fairly good health, high levels of education. Um, but from an infrastructure point of view, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. There had been no infrastructure development basically since the 1930s. So as a result, what China really needed was a significant increase in investment in both infrastructure and in manufacturing capacity. Now, what Gershon-Krohn argued was that developing countries have very high investment needs, but they have very low savings. And so they rely on foreign savings, or they had in the past to a significant extent. And the classic example, of course, is the United States in the 19th century. But he argued that foreign savings was very risky. So you have to develop, one of the things you have to do is to push up the domestic savings rate, very much like the Soviet Union did in the 1930s and 40, well, after the war, basically through scarcity. You have to force up the savings rate. And what Gershon-Krohn said is that forcing up the savings rate is quite straightforward. Take money away from the consumers, which were typically farmers and ordinary households, and put it into the banking system and use that to to fill your investment needs. And that's exactly what China did, perhaps more successfully than any other country in history. You had all of these mechanisms that basically forced households to subsidize growth by forcing up their domestic savings. Very low interest rates were a tax on their savings. An undervalued exchange rate is basically a tax on net importers, who are the household sector. Environmental degradation, low wage growth relative to productivity. All of these things meant that as China grew, household income grew much more slowly. And because household income grew more slowly, so did household consumption. So by definition, the gap between the growth in consumption and the growth in GDP was the growth in savings. So China very quickly developed the highest savings rate probably in history. And these savings, they were not just the savings of the household sector. They were the savings of the household sector, the savings of businesses, and the savings of government, which together amounted to the highest savings rate ever. And it was all poured into the banking system, and the banks, because of very low interest rates, basically encouraged anybody to borrow money and invest in almost anything. Now, when you're hugely underinvested, you don't have to be very sophisticated in your investment process because almost everything is productive. When I came to China, we had the first subway system in China, and it was basically one line for about a mile or so. Now we've got, I think, 13 or 15 subway systems just in Beijing alone. So you can imagine at that point, almost anything you build is productive. More roads, more bridges, subway systems, trains, factories, et cetera, et cetera. So this was a very successful model. And while the household sector was penalized because they were forced to subsidize all of this growth, it didn't really matter because GDP was growing so quickly that households were doing well anyway. Basically, GDP grew at around 10% and household income grew at around 7%, which, as you know, most countries would kill for. But notice what happens. The gap between household consumption and GDP gets bigger and bigger. In other words, household income and household consumption becomes a smaller and smaller share of GDP. Now, that's not a problem as long as you have nearly infinite investment needs. But the problem that China had was with such a rapid increase in investment, but the fastest increase in investment in history, at some point, and I would argue probably in the late 90s, perhaps in the early part of the last decade, they closed the gap between what they could productively absorb and what they actually had. Now, when that happens, you're supposed to change your growth model. And here I'll mention one of Alexander Gershon-Krohn's contemporaries and good friend, Albert Hirschman. And Hirschman said that the success of the growth model undermines the reason for having that growth model. In China's case, the success of this high savings, high investment model meant that at some point you no longer needed high levels of investment, so you have to shift the model. But Hirschman said, no country ever does it until it's much too late. And he argued that this is for political reasons. And let me explain the political reasons. But once you've reached the point where you've produced all of the investment you can productively absorb, then continued rapid increases in investment result in a significant increase in the debt burden. And it's not a coincidence that every country that's followed this model, at least 24 since the Second World War, started with very healthy rapid growth, followed by very rapid unhealthy growth in which the debt burden soared, and then followed by a difficult adjustment. And that's what's happened in China. At some point, we can argue when it happened, but we started to see huge amounts of non-productive investment, unnecessary infrastructure, excess capacity, and with it, soaring debt. Now, how do you solve that problem? Well, you have to bring all of this investment down, all of this non-productive investment down. But it's this non-productive investment that's generating all of the economic activity that's keeping people employed. So if you bring it down, unemployment should go up. So you've got to do something else. What else can you do? Well, one thing in theory is you can find productive investment, perhaps by the private sector, and shift from non-productive public sector investment to productive private sector investment. Now, that's never worked, and there are a bunch of reasons for that. I won't get into it, but certainly that didn't work in China. So what else can you do? Well, if you want to bring investment down, then you can switch the production from the domestic side, domestic investment, to the trade surplus. And in fact, China's trade surplus beginning in 2003, 2004, soared to either the highest or the second highest trade surplus in history as a share of global GDP. But if you're Singapore, you can get away with that. If you're a large economy, you really can't. And of course, I argued in my 2013 book that China and Germany's very high trade surpluses were part of the reason for the crisis of 2008, 2009. The world simply can't absorb a 10% of GDP trade surplus from a country as big as China. So ultimately, there's pressure on you to reduce your trade surplus, and China's trade surplus collapsed after 2009. Now think about it in terms of investment and savings. So a high trade surplus or current account surplus means savings vastly exceeds investment. When the world is in crisis and is no longer able to absorb your exports, you get a collapse in the trade surplus, which is another way of saying you get a collapse in the gap between savings and investment. So there's two ways that gap can contract. Either savings can come down or investment can go up. Now, there's so much non-productive investment, you don't want investment to go up. You want savings to come down. So how do you do that? Well, one way is you fire lots of workers. That reduces the savings rate. Clearly, China didn't want to do that. Another way you can do it is to boost household debt, encourage households to borrow like crazy to increase their consumption. But that's not sustainable. In fact, China did that in the last 5 or 6 years, and clearly that's not sustainable. And you can't really solve a debt problem by increasing debt in another part of the economy. It's also very hard to do quickly. The only other way you can really cause consumption to go up is with a massive transfer of wealth from businesses and governments to the household sector. Then households become much richer, and their consumption goes way up, and that can replace domestic investment as a source of growth. But not only is that hard to do quickly, it's politically very tough. And before I go into that, let me just explain what China actually did. Because the only way to bring savings down was either through a redistribution of wealth, which they couldn't do, an increase in household debt, which they couldn't do quickly enough, or an increase in unemployment, which they didn't want to do, then instead of reducing savings, they increased investment. And we saw a massive expansion of investment in 2009, 2010, which many people argued was the beginning of China's debt problem. I think it started earlier, but that doesn't matter. But rebalancing has meant very specifically, we need to solve this problem of excess investment by replacing investment with consumption. Now, this is just an arithmetic problem. There's nothing very complicated about it. If you want consumption to go up and you don't want it to go up because of an increase in household debt, then the only way it can go up is through an increase in household income. So you have to increase the household share of China's GDP. The problem is a political problem, because if I increase my share, then I must reduce your share. And in China, who is the you? The you are the local elites and local governments, who are very, very powerful. So when former Premier Wen Jiabao first proposed this way back in 2007, within 6 months that he promised to rebalance the economy, we started to see for the first time in the Chinese press the phrase vested interests, which were the very powerful political opposition to the goals that Beijing had set for itself. In recent years, we've seen the reemergence of this rebalancing proposal, but with a different name. Now in China, we call it the dual circulation model. It's the same thing, basically. But the point that I would make, and this is really at the heart of the argument of our book, is that if you want to reduce China's dependence on a trade surplus and on non-productive investment, you must increase its dependence on domestic consumption. And the only way to do that is with a massive wealth transfer. I calculate that something like 15 percentage points of GDP must be transferred from local governments and the elite to the household sector. But I don't need to tell you, that's a massive transfer. It's easy to say, and it's an arithmetical necessity, but it's politically very tough to do. And so what we're waiting to see is whether there's anything new in the dual circulation model that explains why they'll be able to do something that they were never able to do for over a decade. I think that's a bit of a long answer, and I apologize, but let me stop there.
Thanks, Michael. Matt, let me turn to you on more sort of the international dimension of this question. Given the problems associated with sort of these imbalances, which have risen in the past globally, how should the policymakers at a global level respond to this? Are there sort of policy prescriptions that the world needs to coordinate on that might help, as opposed to each country fighting for itself? I mean, those are the two different ways one could think of this issue. So if you were to kind of approach it more as a global coordinated problem, are there things you feel that we could do, despite the polarization that we are seeing? If we could move in a more coordinated direction, what direction would you propose we move towards?
Well, I sort of want to challenge the premise of your question a little bit, which is that there actually is a desire among country governments to do anything about this, because sort of the key point of our book is that, or one of the key points of our book is that it's not really, thinking of this as sort of a country versus country dynamic is really the wrong framework. That in general, the interests of elites across countries are in harmony, and in fact, the system as it exists works very well for their benefit at the expense of the majority of people across countries. So it's not so much that Chinese workers are benefiting at the expense of American workers. It's that policies that have been pursued in China by Chinese elites in cooperation with American elites to harm Chinese workers have also harmed American workers. And so from that perspective, the question of changing things looks a lot different, because it really is about having domestic political changes first that will then lead to rebalancing of incomes within the major economies and societies, and that would sort of naturally solve the problems we're talking about. And from that perspective, you can either be optimistic that this is something that can be done, because in democracies, maybe we'll learn things and we'll fix it, or be very pessimistic and say, well, it's never going to happen. And you can look at China as an example of the growth model has been so successful at promoting and creating these vested interests who've benefited so much from it that they now have a lot of power to block any changes that will, hurt their position. And so, in theory, the solution would actually be very simple, which is you don't even need to have a coordinated global approach, really. You just have each country independently saying, well, we want to have a healthier distribution of income and do things that would be good for, the people who live in our country. And then naturally that would lead to both less debt, more income, more consumption, and less need for global imbalances. You might still have some, trade imbalances, if you will, but where in the sense that less developed countries would be able to draw upon the resources of more advanced economies in order to increase their development, because truly autarkic development, if what the Soviet Union did in the 1930s, for example, leads to the starvation of millions of people, and most people would rather avoid that as an outcome. If why not? So there's no reason to have we don't want to have all current account balances be zero, but it's useful to think about, you know, why is Europe, for example, which I think is a really important case, if you think about the sort of shift of the past 10 years from the 2000s, is that Europe really emerged as the major surplus economy relative to China as China increased investment. And, that wasn't because Europe became so much more productive or so much better at exports. It was because European domestic demand collapsed. And you just had a persistent levels of poverty and underinvestment and underconsumption in Europe, to the harm of people who live in Europe. It's not like they did this as some trick to take over market share and, oh, Europe is now doing so much better and look at the trade surplus we have with, India or whatever. That's not what happened. It was just that Europeans became a lot poorer. And so Europe could European governments, European policymakers could do things that would make Europeans, the vast majority of Europeans, much better off. And that would naturally have a lot of benefits for people in the rest of the world who could sell more things to people in Europe. But you don't have to have a perspective of global imbalances to fix it. I think, the one thing that might be helpful if we were to sort of think about a global coordination is some mechanism for preventing a lot of these sort of excess production from going into a handful of places. So, the US, as Michael said, absorbs about like sort of 50 to 60% globally the excess production in the world. A lot of the rest of it goes to the other Anglosphere economies. And of course, the thing that the US, UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand have in common is they, first of all, everything's in English, and English, rich people all over the world speak English, so that makes it accessible. And they have very open financial systems and very clear legal systems. So it's very easy for people to put money there, whether it's, a condo in Miami or you buy some farm in New Zealand or what have you. And, I don't think it's necessarily a case where those governments, the first choice they would want to have is say, foreigners can't buy anything here. Although you're already seeing that happen, especially in some of the smaller, Australia, New Zealand, they've been making it, Canada, making it more difficult for foreigners to buy housing. But you could see that as sort of a semi-coordinated approach, or alternatively, you can have some sort of broader global agreement of saying we don't want to have, maybe it's not worthwhile to have lots of, free-flowing investment across borders. But I think the main thing that needs to be dealt with is really the domestic politics and domestic institutions and domestic distribution of income in the major societies. And I think if that were dealt with properly, a lot of the international issues would sort of work themselves out naturally, because all of this sort of trade stuff essentially is residual of these domestic problems.
Thanks, Matt. That's by the way very insightful. There's a quick related question. Maybe you want to take that on, which is about the tariffs or the trade barriers that the U.S. Has been more actively engaged in. Do you see any impact of that to this broader problem of imbalance, or do you think it's largely a sideshow?
Well, it's very easy to see in the data that the U.S. trade deficit did not go down after the tariffs were imposed. In fact, if anything, it went up because there were offsetting forces of, the U.S. was growing faster than countries elsewhere in the rest of the world. What tariffs were able to do was essentially shift trade from certain countries that were being penalized to other ones. So, the U.S. trade deficit with China shrunk relatively, while the U.S. trade deficit with Vietnam increased. But I don't see. I mean, the sort of standard economic argument is if you make tariffs will have a sort of offsetting impact on the exchange rate, so that if you're increasing the returns to having something made in the U.S. for the U.S. market, then people are going to want to buy U.S. assets that will push up the value of the dollar. That will harm U.S. exports and the rest of the world, while also, I mean, it might reduce U.S. imports, but also harm U.S. exports. And so the net effect is that nothing happens. That's sort of the standard theory. It seems like it's sort of played out that way. I mean, you could also argue the tariffs in the U.S. weren't really applied in a systematic way to have really tested this theory. But I mean, you can see plenty of countries that have very high tariffs. Brazil, India have very high tariffs overall, but they generally often have trade deficits. So I don't think there's really any systematic, Germany has essentially no tariffs. So I don't think that's really, the thing that would affect these things.
Thanks. So I want to come back to maybe trying to think about what breaks to solve this problem. If we are unable to solve the problem through domestic politics that Matt was referring to, or whatever issues might be there in China that Michael was referring to, then something will break eventually that will force change, if you will, right? And I want to think through that line of logic a little bit, if you guys can help us through that. So again, the basic premise of your thesis is that there is this imbalance driven by this gap between the working class and the owners of capital, if you will. And that imbalance is driving these trade wars, it's driving these imbalances, it's building up debt, for example, in many countries. Ultimately, this cannot go on forever for obvious reasons. So how do you see this playing out practically, given the political constraints? So each of you can answer that question. Michael, if you want to, you can, for example, make certain predictions, if you will, about how it unwinds in China. So what happens to, for example, Chinese domestic debt that's rising or has risen in recent years as a result of that? So you can take any angle that you wish, but how does it, how does it end at some level? I mean, nothing ends in real life, things continue to go, but how does it resolve itself if local politics is unable to address it?
Well, I think we're starting to see the resolution, and I should warn that historically the resolution, the adjustment process is always very messy, very chaotic, very frightening. But we're starting to see it, and for that I would go back to something that Danny Roderick at Harvard said a few years ago. He argued that most countries, particularly Western-style democracies, face their own kind of trilemma. They can have increasing global integration or more globalization, or they can have control over their domestic national policies, but they can't get both. And for a while, it seemed like globalization was inevitable, and so we were going to increasingly see countries lose control of domestic national policies. But I think we've seen that the world really won't accept that. The election of Trump, Brexit in the case of England, the number of cases around the world has suggested that we've reached the point where people are no longer willing to give up control of domestic issues in exchange for the benefits of more globalization. And needless to say, the benefits have been very unfairly distributed. So my expectation is that we go into sort of a reversal of this globalization process, because imagine, if you will, you're France and you decide you've had enough income inequality, you want to reverse income inequality. So what do? You take steps to shift income away from businesses and the wealthy towards workers. Do you benefit? No, you don't, because as you raise the relative share workers receive of what they produce and you reduce the profitability of the business sector, what ends up happening is that increased demand bleeds abroad. If France were to try to raise domestic wages, the result would be an expansion in the French current account deficit. Same thing in the US. In fact, that's part of the driving process. When businesses say we have to lower wages to remain competitive, they're not being sneaky or evil. It's literally true. They have to lower wages, and then their competitors have to lower wages. So we're locked in this process. So if you want to get out of the process, you can do it either jointly. We can call for a new Bretton Woods. I'm quite pessimistic about that possibility. Or we can do it unilaterally, which I suspect is what will happen. And what matters is for countries like the US, and to a lesser extent the UK and the other open economies, all they have to do is to prevent capital inflows or to increase the frictional cost of capital inflows. Because once that happens, countries can no longer compete on the basis of lowering wages. Then they will only be able to compete on the basis of raising productivity. High wages becomes a good thing, not a bad thing. So I would argue in this highly globalized world, it's very hard to get out of the system. And the direction that we clearly are already going in, I would argue, is towards a world in which countries, bit by bit, give up being part of this hyper globalized system and start focusing once again on regaining control. I know I'm going on a bit, but I want to say when we had this discussion with Adam Tooze, one of the things that he said was most surprising about our book was our argument that countries like the US have no control over the domestic savings rate. And I think that's a very important point. The US simply cannot control its domestic savings rate as long as it's a net recipient of capital outflows from other countries. So the only way to regain control means preventing capital from coming in. Now, we can do it as part of an overall agreement and go back to Keynes's proposal for Bretton Woods, or we can do it unilaterally. I don't know. The former is better, but I think it's more unlikely. But one way or another, we have to reverse this process of globalization, and we will, I'm pretty sure.
Getting to your question about what makes it break, I mean, in a certain sense, it already did, with the sort of global financial crisis. And what's interesting is that that didn't lead to kind of any systematic changes. It led to some shifts. So, for example, China's current account surplus came down pretty dramatically relative to the size of the Chinese economy. Not in absolute terms. In absolute terms, China's current account surplus is now about the same size it was before. China's economy is just a lot bigger relative to the rest of the world. And then, on the flip side of though, you saw Europe's current account surplus emerge in a very massive way. You saw deficits also shift. So the US current account deficit shrunk, but deficits in the rest of the Anglosphere increased, and you saw very large borrowing booms in a lot of emerging market economies that have since been forced to contract, whether it was Turkey or Argentina or what have you. So it didn't really. In some way, it did break, and yet it somehow sustained. So I don't really have a great answer for you. I guess it could last for a lot longer than we'd think. I mean, one of the points that we make in sort of the beginning of the book is that this is not the first time the world has had this kind of situation. In the late 19th, early 20th centuries, John Hobson made the point that this was essentially the way of thinking about the global economy then, where the surplus economies were, the UK, France, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, so forth, and then the deficit economies were essentially the colonies and dominions of the imperial, subject states. And that lasted for a while. It broke down ultimately because of World War I, not because of anything actually the unsustainability of the empires otherwise. In the 1920s, you had sort of a recreation of that sort of model, but with different, the US was a surplus economy, and then the big deficit countries were actually in Europe themselves. That broke down with the Great Depression. And even then it took a while before things adjusted. So I don't really have a great answer for you. I mean, to pointing to your work, I mean, if the thing that lubricates this and makes it sustainable is ever increasing levels of debt, particularly ever increasing levels of debt that often aren't associated with any sort of commensurate increase in productive assets, that's not a sustainable process. I mean, this is what a lot of your research has shown pretty conclusively. So, it doesn't necessarily, you can't say necessarily when it will be unsustainable, but it's not something that is, can last forever. So, it would break down, I think, in the way that you would sort of normally see that breakdown, with eventually some kind of massive debt restructuring and, asset write-downs and so forth, and all the associated economic harms that come from that.
We just have 1 minute left, Matt, but just there's one question just related to this. One solution to this underconsumption problem, driven by, again, this gap between the elites and the working class, could be that the government just continues to run deficits, right? And so this is sort of, I guess, the MMT philosophy as well at some level. Do you agree that that's a possible path going forward? And B, do you predict that at some level that we'll just see much higher levels of government deficits globally in response to this fundamental problem that you have declared?
Arithmetically, that certainly works. I mean, you can think of it as sort of a roundabout way of doing an income and wealth redistribution. If governments are borrowing from the rich at negative real interest rates, and then spending in ways that disproportionately don't go to the rich, or you could just give equal amount of money to everyone, and sort of mathematically that's still going to be a case where you're transferring income, then the government would essentially be a conduit for doing the kind of thing we're talking about. Whether it's the most efficient way of doing it, I don't, maybe politically it is, I don't know. But I mean, mathematically that is exactly the same thing. And so it would definitely have, if you did it in size, it would definitely work. And there are many countries where that probably is the best way of going about it. I mean, in Europe, for example, the fiscal stance, I think, has consistently been far too tight over the past 10 years. And so that would be, there's not enough public infrastructure investment as an example of something. So in the US as well, you can make that argument. So I think that's certainly a plausible way out of things.
Thank you. Well, and there's still more questions, but unfortunately we are out of time. So let me just thank everyone for joining. We had a great audience, and of course, thanks to Michael Pettis and Matt Klein for joining us. Again, it's really a terrific book and very well written. I read it very quickly, which is always a good sign for me that it's a well written book. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope to see more of your work in the weeks and months ahead. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ram.
Thanks.